10 years since crisis struck, Europe's economy is finally bouncing back, the European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, said on Wednesday in Strasbourg, France. Christian Hartmann, Reuters, Brussels. Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, laid out plans on Wednesday to simplify the Byzantine governance of the European Union. In perhaps the boldest proposal in his annual address to the European Parliament, Mr. Juncker suggested streamlining the leadership of the 28-nation bloc, an idea that could in theory eliminate his own job. The complexity of the European Union is legendary. It has a plethora of institutions and no single leader, leaving many wondering who is in charge, or speculating that Germany, the bloc's largest economy, really runs the show. Mr. Juncker, of Luxembourg, leads the Commission, a mass of powerful bureaucrats. Donald Tusk of Poland leads the European Council, which consists of the leaders of the 28 member nations and sets the Union's overall political direction. Antonio Tajani of Italy is president of the European Parliament. Then there is the Council of the European Union, not to be confused with the European Council, which is made up of ministers and has a 6-month rotating presidency. The structure of the bloc, which reflects decades of gradual evolution, contributes to what scholars call a democratic deficit, the feeling that structures and officials in Brussels are unaccountable to ordinary people. Mr. Juncker seemed sympathetic to this criticism in his remarks on Wednesday, suggesting that a single president should lead both the European Commission and the European Council. The European landscape would be clearer and more understandable if the European ship was steered by one and the same captain at the helm, he said. By looking toward the future, Mr. Juncker to some extent reflected the bloc's at least partial recovery from several acute crises, including a wave of migration from the Middle East and Africa, Britain's vote to leave the bloc, a surge in far-right political forces. Mr. Juncker's wide-ranging speech touched on these themes: the favorable circumstances and relatively healthy economic growth across much of the bloc. This means that the wind is back in Europe's sails, and that there is a window of opportunity for reform, he said. Economic growth, which stands at more than 2% across the European Union, has outstripped growth in the United States, while unemployment has reached a 9-year low, he said. 10 years since crisis struck, Europe's economy is finally bouncing back, and with it our confidence, he said, a reference to the long, grinding battle to overcome a debt crisis that nearly destroyed the euro currency, prompted the imposition of austerity on millions of citizens and helped fuel a populist backlash that focused anger at the European Union. A new European Minister for Economy and Finance, Mr. Juncker suggested that such a minister could be part of the European Commission and could also lead the Eurogroup, a body consisting of finance ministers from the 19 nations that use the euro. That group made many of the decisions regarding Greece during the debt crisis. The idea, he said, would be for this new minister to coordinate among various European bodies to help countries that are in an economic recession or hit by a fundamental crisis. The goal would be efficiency rather to create a new position just for the sake of it, Mr. Juncker said. Proposals in finance, intelligence gathering and cybersecurity. Particularly notable was an announcement that the European Union would soon begin for-reaching trade talks with Australia and New Zealand. That could compete with British efforts to strike trade deals with its Commonwealth partners that London sorely wants as it prepares to leave the bloc. Since last year, I see that our partners all over the world are knocking at our door to sign trade agreements with us, said Mr. Juncker, who cited a deal with Canada that will start to go into force next week, an agreement with Japan and negotiations with Mexico and a group of South American nations. Even as Europe opens up to new trade opportunities, Mr. Juncker said, it must do more to protect strategic sectors like defense, a remark that was essentially a response to calls from Germany, France and Italy to vet the acquisition of European technology by Chinese companies, a warning that Britain's exit from the bloc was very sad and tragic and would come at a cost. We will always regret this, and I think you will regret it as well soon, if I might say, Mr. Juncker told the British to a thunderous burst of applause. In hopes of encouraging a strong voter turnout for European Parliament elections in May or June 2019 and shoring up confidence in the bloc, Mr. Juncker called on Romania, which is set to hold the Union's rotating presidency during that period, to schedule a European Union summit meeting on the day after Britain's planned exit from the bloc, a far tougher line with Turkey, which has taken an authoritarian turn under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. That rules out EU membership for Turkey in the foreseeable future, Mr. Juncker said.